World Teach presentation.
You forgot the time.
There was a party for the new regional director.
The new regional director's wife expected him for supper.
Nicole, this is what we wanted.
No. No, this is what you wanted, Henry.
You benefit as well.
I get to cook more suppers no one eats.
You know sacrifice must be made to get ahead, you know that.
But we are already ahead. We have beautiful children, a beautiful house. We have beautiful things. I see them all the time, but I never see you.
These are my peak earning years, Nicole.
Uh-huh. And also your peak husbanding years, and your peak fathering years, Henry.
Who do you think I'm doing this for? So you can live where you like, how you like, so the children can go to the school you want them to go to.
You never see them. They wake you up on their way to school and say bonjour and au revoir. And by the time you get home, they're already in bed.
So what can I do? I can either see them and not provide for them, or provide for them and not see them. What am I supposed to do?
What does God want from us? It's a simple question, but not a simple answer. If it's true that for everything gained, something is lost, how do we find balance in our lives?
The 7 stages of spiritual growth. With your guide, Dr. Bruce Wilkinson. Consecration, Part 1.
Welcome to the 7 stages of spiritual growth. Of all the 7 stages, I believe this one is the single most important of all 7 for the great majority of everyone who will watch this series. It is stage 2, the stage of consecration. When you think about consecration, it's very similar to dedication. And in your notebook, I want you to take a look at the meaning of consecration because I have much to teach you in this session. Before this session is over, I want you to leave saying to yourself, oh, I really understand what consecration is and how it works. And then the next time we're together, we're going to deal with the practical side, your pilgrimage in consecration. And we'll give you the 5 milestones that everybody must pass through in your own pilgrimage of consecration. But when you try to understand it, what does it literally mean? Well, it's a lot like dedication, except in your notes, consecration is a voluntary dedication of your life to God. The difference between dedication and consecration is you can be dedicated to a job, to a vision in your mind, to a person, and consecration means I am dedicated to God. I am devoted to God. I am committed to God. And therefore, we want to deal with this question about how dedicated are you, most of the time, to God. How much have you given to Him? If you remember, the first 3 stages of the 7 stages are conversion, when you come to meet Jesus Christ as your personal Savior. Consecration is when you respond to what He has done, and as He gave Himself for you, you turn around and give yourself back to Him. Then stage 3 is called conduct, which is when God convicts us of various areas of our life which are displeasing to Him, and He asks us to change them. When He asks that, if you've not at least consecrated some of your life to Him, then you don't really have a basis to change your behavior. I don't want to do what you want me to do, and I've already said no when you've asked me to dedicate myself to you, so why should I do this? But the deeper that you have dedicated yourself to God, the more that you are interested, open to, and obedient to his request. Now, I want you to understand something about dedication. You ever said to somebody, boy, is she ever a dedicated person? Or maybe you saw a person win a gold Olympic medal, and you realized how much dedication it took in their social life and their physical life, and everything that they did and talked and thought about and dreamt about was all that one event at the Great Olympics. Are they more dedicated than you? I don't believe they are. I believe every single one of us are fully dedicated at every moment. It's just what you're dedicated to. That particular person was dedicated to seeking to achieve first place. Well, whatever you decide to do is what you are dedicated to do. If you decide to sit and watch a 3-hour television show and to do that on a regular basis, night after night, you are dedicated to personal enjoyment and entertainment. That's what you have decided to become dedicated to. You could at any moment stand up and say, I don't want to remain dedicated to entertainment for me. I want to dedicate myself to X. So it's not that some people have a lot more dedication. They do not. They have all their dedication. And you and I have all of it. You don't have 50% dedication. You have 100%. It's just whatever you are dedicated to. Now, of all the things that you and I could be dedicated to, this session deals with our dedication to a specific person, to God, to Jesus Christ, and how committed am I to Him. When you think about consecration, consecration is something that is private. It's a commitment of your heart. When you're devoted, I am devoted to my wife. My wife is devoted to me. If you met Darlene today, you wouldn't know she was devoted. You couldn't see it in her eyes unless perhaps I was around or something was going on and you noticed it. But if you met her down at the shopping mall, you wouldn't have any way of knowing, is that person devoted to somebody else? You couldn't know. It's inside, isn't it? Therefore, as I look across all of your faces, I really can't tell which one of you is devoted to God a lot or middle or a little. When you really back away and get the big picture of where we're going in this session, ultimately, there's only dedication to yourself and what you want with people, places, things, goals. I want. Or it is, I'm devoted to you as a person and what you want. So if we took all of our dedication in this conversation and just put it right here, let's put 100 pennies stacked right here. And we set it right here. And there were 2 boxes. One box, I'm devoted to what I want, and I'm devoted to God. And the deal is, take all the 100 pennies and put them somewhere. Where would you put them? Right this moment. Most people would keep most of the pennies. Going to church doesn't necessarily mean you're devoted, does it? You could do it because your parent told you, or because for you to keep a good standing in the community, you need to do it. And you could have an undevoted heart. Well, I want you now to move past the meaning of it and move into 3 important misconceptions about it. Number 1 misconception is that consecration occurs without struggle. The average person thinks consecration doesn't have struggle, that it must be easy for you, because it's not easy for me. And I would consecrate myself if it wasn't so hard. The misconception then is that consecration is easy to do. The truth of it is difficult to do. And that's why so few people do it. Therefore, if you are in your mind waiting for the day when the struggle's gone and it's easy for you to consecrate yourself to God, give it up. It won't happen. Now, whenever you ask a person, If I knew that Terry was struggling and only had a few pennies in consecration, and I was talking with him, and he asked me to help him, if I eventually got to the point where I asked Terry the bottom line question, why don't you give yourself over to God? If we crawled inside of Terry's head, we'd find fears everywhere. Whoa, 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 whoa. Like, if I did, God would send me to where? How many say in Africa right here at this moment? In the United States, when you talk to a Christian, a person who's met Christ, about giving himself to God, it's a universal response, which is, if I really do that, he'll send me to Africa and I'll live in a hut. Now, I don't know where that idea came from. If you ask people in Africa to consecrate themselves to God, they say, oh no, God will send me to downtown New York City. You know what it is? It is a realization that right now, he can't send me because I'll say no. And if I really consecrate myself to him, he has every right to say, go over there. And therefore, it's fear. You talk to some other people about this concept, and they say, I remember talking to a group of men about this. They said, if I consecrated myself to God, I'd have to quit my job, you know, and go be a minister and preach all the time. And of course, to that guy, that was the worst thought that there was. And I understand that. But see, it was, I can't do that for me. I have to become somebody else, and then I can do it. But not me. I couldn't be further from the truth. Other people think, if I really turn my life over to God, he's going to ask me for every penny that I have. Everything. And he'll take away my house, my car, and I'll be penniless underneath the bridges. You ever thought that? Some of you thought that. You're nodding like crazy. You know what we do? We take the extremes every single time. The worst possible case, and say, since God could do that, there's no way I'm going to let him do that. By the way, if he wanted to take every cent you owned away, does he need your permission today? He doesn't need your permission today. But the question is, you haven't given him your permission. And that's what consecration is. It's when you and I give our permission. Number two, here's the second misconception, that consecration is a one-time experience. That if something can occur at a big service or a rally, or I was talking to a man in Israel once, he said, you know, if there's a blinding light like the Apostle Paul did on the road, then I would consecrate. And I said, is that the only way you'll do it? He said, that's the only way you'll do it. He's believing it's a big event. Other people say, well, if I can just go to a meeting when such and such a person is there and these things happen, why, I am going to do it. As if it is, I am not really consecrated, and now I'm consecrated. It just doesn't work that way. Well, what did happen? Well, you consecrated some. But the truth of it is, it's not a one-time event. If, for instance, if you have a little daughter and she's 9 years old, and God and her are really working along, and she says to you, Mommy, I want to give God my whole life tonight. I met Jesus last year at Bailey Vacation Bible School, but right now, I love him so much, I want to give him my whole life. Isn't that a wonderful moment, just thinking about that? Well, if you were to look inside the little girl's heart, that's 100% consecration. But you know, when she gets older, and she gets about 18, and she's got to have a whole other struggle. And to think that everything that could have been done is done here isn't really true. It is that there are many different times that consecration happens. It happens here, it happens here, it happens here, it happens here. It keeps on happening. It's not one time. There really is, to be honest with you, as a grown person, usually one big crisis which occurs. But there are many different times, and there are many different levels. What do I mean by that? Oh, you could say, Lord, I consecrate, I dedicate to you 10% of what money I have. It's mine, I hereby give it to you. I consecrate it to you. You can consecrate a thing. You can consecrate a person, a place. And then somebody comes along and says, but I need some of this. No way. This is mine. This is yours. So this may be consecrated, but all this isn't. So there are different levels, aren't there? There's different times and there's different levels. And ultimately, consecration is meant to become something that happens all of the time. When you get up in the morning, before you get out of that bed, consciously consecrate yourself to Him. Number 3 is a deep misconception. This is the conception that has the thought that consecration is the same thing as conversion. That they take stage 2 and stage 1 and they dump them together. And that when you meet Jesus Christ, it means you have fully devoted yourself to Him. And if you haven't, then you've not truly been converted. The Bible teaches those are different things. Is it possible to accept the work of Jesus on the cross and what He did without me doing anything? Yes. That's the whole point. It's a gift He gives to me, and I receive it. Whether or not I decide to devote myself to Him more and more and more is really up to me. He invites me to do this, but He doesn't make me do it. So as I travel around the world, it's become real apparent that 3/4 of any audience has not even got early on to the stage of consecration. They have not. They've met Christ, but they've not responded back to Christ because of the fears that are there. And to be honest with you, it is most of the time that consecration takes a long time for people because it's not talked about. And it could be 10 years, 20 years, 30 years after you accept Christ that you give yourself back to Him. And some people never do. So that's a major, complicated issue. Consecration is not required by God for salvation, and consecration radically influences one's conduct. Now, the third thing I want to deal with is the mindset for consecration. And it comes out a key verse. It is Romans chapter 12, verse 1. Let me read it to you. It says, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. Of all the verses, the thousands of verses in the Bible, this one is the clearest one about consecration. And it has 5 things I want you to see. The verse starts out and says, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, that I want you to present yourself to God as a living sacrifice. That means I give myself to you. I beseech. It's an invitation, not I command. You can't command somebody to do this. This is of the heart. God says, I invite you to do this because of who I am and what I've done, but you don't have to if you don't want to. I invite you to do it. And I beseech you, therefore, brethren. He's talking to Christians in the book of Romans. Christians who are already born again, but have not become consecrated. They've not done it. And the church is over 10 years old. So there are believers in that church at least 10 years old who have not done this yet. That's why he's asking them to do it. So point number 1 is consecration is acceptable to God after you are born again. After. He's asking believers. If you ask a non-Christian, a person who's not met Christ, to devote themselves to God, what they're doing is sincere and genuine, but they're doing works to earn their salvation, rather than because they are born again, they give themselves back to God. Point number 2. Consecration is an official act of voluntary presentation. It's something you do. It says, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies. You remember when Jesus was little, Joseph and Mary brought the baby Jesus to the temple and presented Jesus. They actually made an official presentation of Jesus as a baby back to God. Presentation means I come of my own free will in an active, official moment, and I take myself, I hold myself, and I present myself. Lord, here I am. And the question is to a Christian, will you decide to do this the same way Joseph and Mary did to their children, to do it to yourself? If you've never done that, then you haven't done it. If you have, I guarantee you remember it, because it's a difficult thing to do at that particular moment. Number 3, consecration occurs when you release to God complete control. It says, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies, here it is, a living sacrifice. It's a shocking thing. The picture in the Old Testament was a Jew would bring an animal to sacrifice it, and the sacrifice literally meant it died. But here, the picture is, you bring yourself, not another animal. You bring you, because you want to, and you bring yourself to God. I don't know how to say this, and you die to yourself. And yet you remain alive. So up till now, I've been alive to me. I've done what I want to do, when I want to do it, how I want to do it. That's what I do. I'm mine. I'm alive to me. And God says, well, you can if you want to, but you can also decide to take you and die to you. Take your hands off. No ifs, ands, or buts. You are giving yourself to God. You're dead to yourself, but you're alive to Him. So if He said to you, you're right. Believe it or not, I do want you to go to that hut in Africa or the downtown New York. Then you would say, yes, sir. Yes, sir. It's complete control. 4th thing, consecration that is genuine is received by God. How? You may be sitting there saying to yourself, yeah, but if you knew what I've done in my life, you would never... God wouldn't want me because of what I've done. But this verse shows something absolutely wonderful. That you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable. It's acceptable to God, which means if you ever come to the place in your life where you pick yourself up with all the stuff that's true about you and true about me, and you pick yourself up and say, God, I want to give myself to you. God's on the other side saying, I accept you. I accept you. It's acceptable. You don't have to fix something. You present it. And God says, I'll receive it because you're giving it to me. You remember that consecration precedes conduct. We think it goes this way. If I can just get my life together, then I'll give myself to God. And God's the opposite. Give yourself to me first, then we'll work on your life. That's why Romans 12:1 asks for your life, and the rest of Romans tells you what to do and obey. The last point is that consecration, I used to think that consecration was this big step, you know, wow, I hope I could do it. And this verse says the exact opposite. Exactly the opposite. It says this: consecration should be completely logical and reasonable to you. The verse says this: a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, comma, which is your reasonable service. What does that mean? What does that mean? It means if you do this, you ought to say to yourself, I want to do this. Here's the reason I want to do this. Nobody's making me. Although God may ask hard things of me, I want to go there. Why? It makes sense to me. How does it come to the point in which it makes sense? Because most people it doesn't make sense. That's why they don't do it. We skipped a phrase in that verse. I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present yourself. Mercies of God, what is that? It's like Paul's saying, you're standing here at this line, and I want you to turn around. Because, you know, the verse starts, I beseech you, therefore. And he's saying, in the first part of my book of Romans 1 through 11, I told you of all the wonderful things God has done for you. Of how he sent his son to die for you, that he sent his spirit into you, of what he has planned for you, that he's working everything together for your good, and that he's wonderful and kind and merciful. And since he's that kind of God and has that done for you, and the Bible says, eye has not seen and ear hasn't heard what God has prepared ahead of time for those who love him, that you say to yourself, why would I ever say no to God? And a moment goes on, you say, I've been the most arrogant person possible, thinking I can run my life a lot better than God. And that I'll be much happier living here in Atlanta against the will of God than if God says, go move in the hut in Africa, because he said that's where I want you and that's where you will be so happy and fulfilled. So you know what it is? I don't trust you, I trust God. Why would a person not trust God? As we wrap this session up, you need to be asking yourself a very serious and important question. And that question is, do you honestly think you can control your life so it turns out better than God can do for you? As you look around in your life, would you say, you know, I've made really good decisions all along, and I'm really full of joy and happiness, and I know that I'm doing things that are so meaningful and important to God? Or when you fight this battle with God, when God's not really battling, God's inviting. You and I are doing the battling. And he says, it's really the truth. He says to you, if you just believed exactly the way I am and what I have done, you would run to me and say, please take me. I want to be your living sacrifice.
A World Teach presentation.
Please, Henry, have a seat. We need to talk. Please. You have always worked very hard. Do you remember when Sunday was family day? We went to church, to brunch, to the park. It was always set aside. Now you spend the day in your office.
I'm too busy.
You're too busy for me, for our children, too busy for God.
I do not have time for everything.
Perhaps the problem isn't a lack of time, but your choices of how to spend that time.
I do not understand what you're saying.
You're not committed to our family or to God. You're committed only to your career, Henry.
It has to come first.
No, God is first. Then everything else will come.
I have everything else.
Do you? Yeah, you have a bonus, a title, a chauffeur-driven limousine, all the perks, and for what? Longer hours, more stress, more pressure to keep your job. When you climb the corporate ladder, how do you know when you get to the top you'll be happy?
All our lives, we are taught that success brings happiness.
And has your success brought you happiness?
There is no other way. You work hard and you get ahead. That is life.
I suppose it is. But does it have to be?
The distractions of life control us far more often than we control them. A drive for success often takes our eye off of God, and we can find ourselves consecrated to our own work instead of to Him. But how much of this pressure is our own cross to bear, and how much of it is the result of our own choices?
The 7 stages of spiritual growth. With your guide, Dr. Bruce Wilkinson. Consecration, Part 2.
Welcome to the 7 stages of spiritual growth. We're in Part 2 of Consecration. And I believe this one unit by itself will open so many things to your understanding about your own spiritual growth. Because this is going to be a moment we're going to lay out where exactly are you at this very moment in your pilgrimage of consecration. You know, if we were to ask the Lord how consecrated you are, or how consecrated the person next to you is, or that I am, He wouldn't be a bit vague or confused. He'd know precisely how consecrated you are. And if He brought you right directly to heaven and asked you the question, how consecrated have you been in your life to me? You'd have to admit honestly and openly you've known the answer all along. And it is my desire for all of us in this session that you will make some strong conclusions, that you will present more than you ever have to the Lord, and that you will die to those things you have said no to that He has asked from you. Because He asks the same things from all of us. There isn't 1,000 things that God deals with in consecration. There's really only a handful of issues He'll bring right to your attention. I want you to give me this. Will you? And it's at that moment that consecration is so important. Most people don't really understand. It's at that moment that your answer determines the next part of your life. Because if you say no, your life stops there and makes a right-hand turn and goes this way. If you say yes, you go right through it, the whole other area of your life. When any of us says yes at a difficult time, when God's asking of us, there's always a tremendous breakthrough that follows. Maybe not the next day, but within the next week, a breakthrough will occur. Now, I'd like to do 3 things in this session. Session part number 1 is I'd like to deal with the 5 milestones of consecration, and you'll know exactly where you are. And I want to describe a couple of them in particular. Secondly, I want you to be able to pick out where you are on this. That is, this is immature consecration all the way to mature or complete consecration. I want you to be able to say to yourself, whoa, I am right there. I am between part 2 and part 3, and I haven't done 3, and I have done 2, and the next thing I need to do is this. I want you to know exactly where you are. It's so helpful. I know where I am on this. And the last part is I want to give you a general method of how you can consecrate more of your life in all of its ways to the Lord at any time you want to. So point number 1, what are the 5 milestones? Well, obviously, stage number 2 follows stage number 1. And it's only when you accept Christ as your Savior that you even stand at the edge of consecration from God's point of view. I've met a lot of nice people who are very devoted to God, but from God's point of view, He's not accepting it because they didn't go through Christ. They just made up their own way. Some people who sacrifice greatly in ways God never asked them to sacrifice. They've invented it. This is how I'll be devoted to God. I will do these things. And God said, I never asked you to do that. Why are you doing that? I don't want you to do that. That doesn't mean you're more devoted. See, devotion is a part of the heart. Well, when you enter consecration, if you just turn back over your shoulder just for a split second, you'd realize that you've been in control of your life, in your mind, all along. Now, you may have thought when you were younger your parents were in control, and they were to a point. But as adults, you are in control of your own life, in a sense, in your mind. And before you met Christ, there wasn't anything in your mind that you were really wanting to do what God wants to do in particular. But now you've met Christ, you're at the beginning of consecration, and the truth of the matter is, the first stage is you are just a person to that point who said no to God every time He may have asked you. And you've been self-oriented, haven't you? I guess I would call this self-indulgent right here. You indulge yourself in whatever you would like to, and you've not at all moved further toward God and giving yourself to Him. Now, in this first time, which may be real quick, and you may move right to the second milestone, or you may stay there for a long time. You may stay right here. The second level, or the second milestone, is when God, who is at this end of consecration, and is asking you to come in this direction at all times, and will whisper in your heart that He wants you, and He wants this part of you, He will begin, if you're open and turn toward Him, He will begin sending you some tests of consecration. And He will ask you for little things that feel real big to you because you're a baby in this. But He'll ask for a little thing, and it's His request and your desire not to do it, that the struggle occurs. This is a universal thing. You're self-indulgent here. If you move away from that, start moving toward God, you will become what I call a consecration struggler. You will have tests. God doesn't announce those tests to you. They're just sent to you. That same test may not bother anybody else, but they bother you. I remember teaching this once to a group of people, and the next week, a lady, maybe 34, 35, came right up, and she said, "It happened to me." I said, "What happened to you?" "Just what you said last week, and this consecration stuff." I said, "Well, tell me what happened." She said, "Well, my best friend was moving to an apartment, and she asked me if I'd help her, and I helped her all day. And when we were done, we sat down on the sofa, and we looked at the wall right here above the fireplace, and it was bare. And she said, I turned to my girlfriend and said, "Do you have a picture there?" And she says, "No, I don't have any money for a picture at this point." And she said, at that moment, God said, "Give her your oil painting." I said, "You have an oil painting?" She says, "Of everything in my apartment, I have one thing I love. It's the oil painting." She says, "Every morning I make a hot cup of tea, sit down, put my feet up, and look at the picture." And when God said, "Give her the picture," everything in me said, "Anything but the picture. I will buy her a picture, but I'm not giving her the picture." I said, "Sounds like you were tested." "It was bad." She said, "I hated every minute of it." "Well, what'd you do?" "I didn't say yes." "Okay, but I wanted to say yes." So she said it took a few days till finally she said, "In the morning I was crying because I knew the Lord was asking me for this, and I was saying no, and if I said no, I'd go backwards, and I didn't want to go backwards. I want to go forward, and I knew this was a test, and He said please, and I said no." And I said, "What'd you do?" I said yes. "Oh, good. What'd you do?" I wrapped up my present. I cried the whole way. I drove all the way over. I knocked at the door and said, "Here is a gift for you." And she was crying. I said, "How is it now?" She says, "I had a huge breakthrough in my life." Those tests, that painting wouldn't have bothered you. And you know what? If it didn't, He wouldn't have asked you for the painting. So those tests then are different, aren't they? I have some characteristics about these tests. Number one, the consecration tests are always personal. They're just for you. And somebody else will say, "Well, why was that so hard?" Number two, the tests are always difficult. Your heart doesn't want to agree with His heart. That's difficult. Number three, It's unexpected. God doesn't give you an announcement. It just shows up at the most unexpected moment. It's unexpected, and it always produces an inner crisis inside of your heart. There could be a raging war going on between you and him because he asked you to devote part of you or something you have that's important to you to him, to choose him above choosing you. That's the whole issue of consecration. And lastly, you can either turn away from that or you can go through it. Consecration tests result in a consecration change. Consecration change. What do I mean? She knew the truth. Had she said no, God would have let her obviously say no, and she'd remained there for a little while, but her heart closed to God, and she knew it. She would eventually slide backwards, and she would become less consecrated. You don't just stay there. You either go forward or you go back. As these struggles are orchestrated by God, because he wants you there. He knows that's the most wonderful place in all of life, is to be fully consecrated to him, and he wants you to be happy and thrilled. He sends them kind of at the edge of your life, here and then here and then here, and he brings them in, and he's seeking for you to say yes to him, yes to him, yes to him, yes to him. Oh, okay, to him. Until finally, there's enough of you that's been given to him that he stands at the big center spot. The middle one's always the crisis spot. And it's at this point he says, I want you. I don't want your picture. I want you. And he asks you, as he's been giving you tests that give you stronger and stronger until you come to the point in which you can make the choice yourself. This is the present yourself as a living sacrifice stage. This is a big time issue. Grown men cry at this many times, not just women. Self-indulgent, move toward God, struggler. Sacrifice. Here, Lord. Big release. £1 million go off. Big release. We think we're finished right here. Done. And God doesn't let you know you're not finished. On the other side of this, the Lord asks you to go deeper. And in Luke chapter 14, it talks about this. Let me read it to you. Luke 14, verse 25. And great multitudes went with him, with Jesus, and he turned and said to them, now listen to what Jesus says. If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and his mother, his wife and his children, his brothers and his sisters, yes, and even his own life, he can't be my disciple. Wow. You don't have to hate your mother and father and your children here to be a sacrifice. You give yourself to him. But there's something deeper than that. It's right here. And he's calling you to something even deeper. You consecrate the whole, and then he says, now, let's go really down to the deep issues in your life. And he says, I have to be number one over your wife, over your children, over your parents, over your own life. And sometimes that can be a crisis point. We were in India in January. There was a man there who told me the time that he grew up in a certain kind of family, and they rejected Christ, and when he accepted Christ, the father said, if you get baptized, you will be cast out of this family forever. You will have no inheritance, and I will treat you as dead. Wow. Christ or my whole family. Big, hard choice. And Jesus says, you cannot be my disciple. You can't come to stage 4 unless you put me above every single person. The Bible also says, so likewise, whoever of you does not forsake all that you have, all, 10%, all that you have, you can't be my disciple. These are hard things. God doesn't mean there to take all of your money and all of your things and give it away He sometimes asks people, but hardly ever. Instead, he asks, make up in your mind that if I ask, you will say yes. And you'll never get there until he brings you through the tests, until at the end, he can ask you for everything, and you would give it. It's tremendous freedom and liberty. This is becoming a disciple of Christ. And there are five branches or paths that come down this next part of your life. And I've already told you of a couple of them. Number one, you have to present throughout your life every person to the Lord. Very hard to do. You took ownership of your son and daughter, and God says, I gave them to you. Will you present them back to me? You know how much you love your kids. And so he's asking for them, and when you do, the ownership ends and the stewardship starts. And you look at your child differently from that point on. And you pick up your spouse, and you pick up yourself. So you present yourself until there's no one that you deeply care about in your whole life that is ahead of Jesus or is out of his realm of control in your heart. Same with money. So point number one, you present to God every person. Number two, you present to God every possession, including your retirement, the best rug or the house or the famous whatever it is you have. You present to God every place. Every place. If he says, I want you to move to, well, you say, nah! I was with a group of full-time Christian workers in another country that was very difficult, hard living. And God was moving, and I said to the people, 65 of us one morning, I said, let's tell the Lord in our opening prayer, if he wants us to move here, for him, we'll all be willing to move. And we were going to pray. No one prayed. And I said to them, do you understand the question? Well, yes. I didn't catch it. I didn't catch this. And finally, one older man says, none of us want to pray that. And you know, that was a sad moment. That was a sad moment. That said, there were 65 friends of mine that had not presented place. That's sad. Because somewhere along the line, if you're going to keep on going, place can't have a nail in it. Number four, present to God every position you have, the prestige you may have, and the power that you have. And lastly, you present to God your goals, your dreams, and your purpose. You had these dreams, these goals, these purposes. You then say, I take these goals and give them to you, and you have the right to end anyone you want, change anyone, postpone anyone, eliminate anyone, and make them all new if you want. You march to a different drumbeat. That takes years, doesn't it? Those people who are in this process, they're nodding deeply. They know all about this. Well, there's another one, as I've chased through Scripture, trying to understand. And it's milestone number 5, and it's found in a passage in the Old Testament, in Exodus chapter 21. And here's what it says. I'm going to apply this to us because I believe it's true. Exodus 21 says, if you buy a Hebrew servant, he shall serve you 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go out free and pay nothing. But if the servant plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free, then his master shall bring him to the judges. He shall also bring him to the door, or to the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him forever. We don't think there's more to becoming a sacrifice, but there is. We don't think there's more to becoming a servant of the Lord, really, or a disciple of his, but there is. This is where you serve him. This is where you are his slave. This is where you have rights and you have no rights. Something you do, this is something you become. And it's that person in the Old Testament who says, I don't want to go free even though I am free. I want to stay and serve you forever. That he came over to the doorpost and put his ear and in front of the judges, so it was an official act. They took a little awl, a little punch, and put a hole right here so that other people could realize this isn't a slave, this is a free man who has become a bond slave, a person of their own free will. At the end of discipleship, there's another stage in my mind. It's called becoming a slave of Christ, because you want to. And it's a bond slave. And it's beyond this, in which you totally give up all rights because you don't want them. And all that matters to you at that point is Jesus Christ. And what he wants of you is all that matters, because you have died to the things that mattered, so that all that matters is Jesus Christ. And at that point, since he is all that matters, then that's all that matters to you. Now, the last thing I would like to do is called the method of consecration, and just share with you 5 simple steps in your workbook of how do you grow or take a step of consecration. You remember, you can consecrate a thing, you can consecrate a person, you can consecrate a goal or a dream or a vision. You can consecrate your whole life. And I'm going to give you 5 things that I use in my own life when a time of consecration occurs. Take a look in your workbook and follow along with me. Number 1, recognize what the Lord is asking you to consecrate. Because when consecration comes and you feel you should be giving something to the Lord, you'll know it, because he'll be asking for it. And what you need to do is not allow that emotion to be vague. Identify clearly, this is what God's asking me to devote back to him, and get it in your mind and know what it is. Number 2 is reconsider carefully the costs of consecrating this to God. You know, there's only one time that I'm aware of that Jesus said to count the costs, and it's right in the passage of Luke where he's talking about being a disciple, and he said, you know, forsake everything you have to be my disciple, then count the costs before you do that. Count the costs. You need to count the costs, because if God asks you for something and you give it, then you realize you've lost control of it, and you've given it to God, and it's no longer yours. And you can't come back and say, I want it back, because you've given it to him. Number 3, return. After you've done this in your mind, return to the Lord with someone or something to present. Remember, you present yourself. So whatever it may be, if it's a person, picture that person in your mind, put it on your hands, and come to the Lord and present it to the Lord. If it's a vision or a dream you want to achieve, or it's something you want to buy, or if it's something you have, if it's whatever it may be, put it in your hands and officially bring it to present. Number 4, release. When it's there, you got to release it. Release and transfer ownership and control as a sacrifice. You are dying to this and giving it to him. The transfer, even though it's still here, it's still here. You can give your house and consecrate your house to the Lord and give it to him, but boy, he has every right in the world to use it in a different way than you've been using it. And you transferred it, it's still there, but you look at it altogether in a different way. And lastly, rejoice that the Lord accepts it totally as genuine from you, and it's acceptable to him. It's acceptable that that transfer literally occurred. And as we wrap up this session, then the question I have is, what's God asking you to consecrate? Where are you on this? How do you feel about what you've just heard? Isn't it utterly remarkable that God asks you and is interested in you and is interested in me, and asks you to devote yourself to him, as if he needs our devotion? We are the ones who need to be devoted to him, because without it we are lost and we have no rudder, and all we have is ourself, and we are selfish and protected. But as you pass through this self-indulgent, scattered, sacrifice servant, slave, you must understand that that's where all the apostles got, over there. That's why when Paul starts a letter, he says, Paul, comma, a slave of Jesus Christ, or James 1:1, James, comma, a slave of Jesus Christ, Peter, a slave of Jesus Christ, Jude, a slave of Jesus Christ. May you become a slave of Jesus Christ.